Welcome to Navigating Disruption. This is a special bonus episode of the Changing the Terms podcast, and it's also the last episode of the Changing the Terms podcast and the first episode of the Navigating Disruption podcast. First thing I'd like to do is introduce you to Janet Hitchen, who's going to be my co-host going forward. I brought her in for a couple of reasons. I think the main reason is that she and I share a commitment to supporting communication professionals in particularly challenging times. But she also comes at things from a different angle. She's got a very strong focus on sustainability and how to align internal comms activities with business strategy. And plus, as you can tell by her accent, she's from the UK. And so she brings that sensibility into the conversation. My view is somewhat different. I come from a political background. I've been focusing on particularly internal comms and broader communication strategy. And I think that between the two of us, we can help you navigate the disruption that's going on and will be going on in the months to come. Janet, do you have anything to say to add to your introduction?
No, thank you, Mike. I think the one thing that I would add is that we generally tend to have very open and frank discussions, and we go with that concept of disagreeing agreeably sometimes, and sometimes violently agreeing with each other. But we never shy away from having a difficult conversation. So I will never say to you, "Oh yes, I agree," just because it's the easiest thing to do, and I think you don't do that with me either.
Except when I do agree. Except when I do agree, and I have nothing else to add, then I'll do that.
Absolutely. But that when we're in violent agreement, then the world is fabulous. But I think it's great that we don't sort of sit politely and just sort of, oh yes, that's a lovely thought, and move on. We're both going to be very honest with each other in what we think, and also if we don't have any thoughts or we're still processing thoughts, we'll be honest about that too. So yeah,
Right. We'll be interested in what people have to say in the comments and in the um, in their shares of the podcast as well. I mean, we intend for this to be a broader discussion than just simply us entertaining you for 45 minutes.
Absolutely. This is all about hearing what other people have to say about what we've said. And people can agree, they can disagree. If you're going to disagree, always have a why, always have a reason. Don't just say, I think what you said was stupid, because that's kind of not very helpful. Be constructive, and it's about driving those conversations forward. It's about driving that understanding, and as you said before, it's about making sure that communicators have something that they need that is helpful to help them navigate the next 6,
Yeah,
12,
and certainly
18 months.
the guests we're going to have on board are going to also have some interesting things to say about that as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
we'll be continuing with the same idea that I started with, changing the terms of bringing voices who are not the usual suspects. So
100%.
people who've got interesting perspectives from different angles. But I wanted to kick this version off with really just a general discussion of where we're at, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the United States elections. And a theme that really came to me this morning as I was setting up for the podcast is that we were going from comms disruption to really a concept of navigating disruption.
Mm.
And for me, that derives from what I would call an end to complacency, that we've seen a ton of, of complacency in the market for communications people over the last really 3 or 4 years. That organizations have felt that they could get by with, um, you know, reducing the professionalism in the communications area, focusing on more junior people, you know, distributing,
Mm.
kind of freely through TikTok and the various other social platforms, and not giving communication strategy and the risk element of communication a lot of shrift. And certainly in the new environment, I would see a fairly radical change in that perspective taking place fairly quickly. What do you have to say about that, Jeff?
I mean, I think complacency is a big word, and the first thing I want to say is because there's part of it I agree with and part of it I disagree with. Of course there is. Hurrah! So complacency feels like a big word, and this isn't complacency necessarily about communications people. There are some communications people who have been complacent. They're very comfortable, so therefore they just, here's my comfort zone, I'm just going to do what I do, isn't this lovely, and that's great. that's going to be a bit of a change. But I think there's a lot of people, communication professionals, who haven't been complacent, but maybe their organisation has. And I think that's a really sort of important distinction. So if anyone kind of heard the word complacent and went, "How dare you?" kind of let's work that through a little bit more. So the communication professional might be sort of raising things, raising issues, raising challenges within their organization, and they may not be getting very far because, as you say, in the last 2 years we've seen communication teams be, I mean, decimated isn't too big a word for some of them. We've seen that sort of, I don't know the right way of saying it because my brain won't figure that out at the moment, but sort of more junior people being brought in to do more senior roles. Or can you be strategic but you've only got 2 years experience? That's really cruel to ask somebody to do that if they've never sort of done it before. Yes, great stretch opportunity, but are you actually going to be giving the right strategic advice to the organization? And as you say, that sort of ability to, hey, we've got all these free tools, we're going to shove a lot of stuff through TikTok. Well, that's great, but is it actually doing what communication should and could do? And strategic communication is about things like reputation management. It's about risk management. It's about, and that sort of comes back to that sustainability piece. Sustainability for me is about, is there a company and is there a planet for that company to be on? Because if the sustainability of your company also needs the sustainability of the earth, to put no too fine a point on it. So are we looking at those sorts of things? And I think some organizations, some C-suites, some boards have thought, oh, we can get away with doing the minimum. And you probably can't. There's some, well, I'm waiting for the cracks to start to show.
Well, I mean, a lot of that, what I would call organizational complacency, has been based on the existence of a shared view of reality. And what we're now seeing is kind of two things, particularly from a sustainability perspective. You have a pivot away from sustainable fuels back towards fossil fuels. It's time for drill, baby, drill, damn the consequences. But also the idea of a shared reality based on a shared, understanding of commonly accepted facts is also, at a societal level, that's also starting to crack.
Yeah.
If not going out the window completely.
I think
so go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think you and I were talking about this earlier, and I'm going to find my notes because I'd made some notes earlier today. And it was comparing the guiding principle of an organization, and I totally stole this from Frank Wolf's book because I'm currently rereading that for my book club. And his guiding principle in the 70s that came from Friedman was to use its resources and engage its activities and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. Pure and simple, designed to increase profits. The end. Then that sort of compares with a business roundtable, which was the US CEOs of the 181 largest companies. I think that's 181. It's kind of really precise. And that said, companies should not only serve shareholders, but should also deliver value to customers, invest in employees, and deal fairly with suppliers, support communities they operate in. And that was in 2018. So having read that this morning again, my question was, does this mean we've now need to have, are we moving into a third definition of what that will be, led by a changed US, led by China, led by India, led by the Middle East? And what does that look like?
Or are we going to see multiple alternatives competing with each other in that space? Say some operating off of the Friedman model of profit first, to hell with everything else, some doubling down on a stronger societal commitment, some, perhaps aligning themselves more tightly with the regimes. I don't know what this looks like in Russia today, but what in terms of the big enterprises in Russia and the extent to which they're integrated with the government there, what that's been, could things be moving in that direction in the U.S. in particular? What I see for communication professionals is at a minimum, and need, whatever the organizational reality is,
Mm.
and need to support organization operating within the context of its chosen reality.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
And knowing what that means. So knowing what those values are and being upfront about it, not hiding it, not living in ambiguity. I think that's one of the sort of the clearest things. If we look at the you and I were talking earlier about the World Economic Forum risks for the last, or I think it was
yeah,
right at the beginning
what
of
are
this
those
year.
World Economic Forum risks?
Yeah, let me just pull them up again so that I don't get them wrong, and I've got them on my phone.
Got it.
So we have got so we've got 2 years and 10 years. So in 2 years, and this was released earlier this year. So this released, I think, January, February. Number 1 was misinformation and disinformation. Number 2 was extreme weather events, and number 3 was societal polarization.
What were number 4 and 5?
4 and 5, cyber insecurity, and then interstate armed conflict, with a very nice one at number 6, which is the lack of economic opportunity, which is sort of linking back into cost of living crisis, etc., etc.
Right. And so what it sounds like is that World Economic Forum was right on the money,
bang on,
predicting this a year ago.
yeah.
And, clearly all of this stuff is in play. Because all this stuff is in play, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to be in play that we need to deal with. I mean, you know, what we're dealing with is kind of multi-dimensional shifts. So there's obviously the huge political shift, from a, kind of a doddering U.S., but still very committed to an extent to the rules-based international order, to, a new paradigm. We don't really know what that looks like in real time. There's the regulatory element. And the thing that I keep coming back to, or at least I've kept coming back to in the last week and a half, has been the regulatory environment as it applies to the internet. Because a lot of what we do in communication assumes that we'll have the same access to the platforms and tools and audiences that we have currently have access to on the same basis. And there's nothing to guarantee that that's going to be the case going forward. Communication infrastructure, trade, and how businesses interact, and what the proposed new tariff regime in the U.S. will do, not just in the U.S. but to those on the other side of it. We've got cultural trends, we've got economic trends. The Trumpies are saying there's going to be short-term pain to get to the place that we're headed. Certainly, Argentina, which is said to be operating kind of as a test case, is going through amazing economic turmoil, like a poverty rate in the 40% range, as they work through some of the proposed structural changes that are being considered for the U.S. And then the legal framework, and to the extent to which laws versus whims are going to apply. So, given that, how do we operate as communication professionals, and how do we help organizations navigate through it?
That's a massive question. That's an enormous question. I think there's a couple of things where this could feel overwhelming really quickly for communication professionals. And the thing is, you can't do everything for everything. So you can't kind of bite it all off. What are the things that we do know? We know that, according to Edelman, businesses are more trusted than NGOs, media, politicians. So we know that business has a place. We know that employees, and I think this was also an Edelman study, a survey that was done with chief communication officers, and it was that employees want their organisations to take a stand, and if it's not take a stand, it's just to know where their employer stands. So you don't have to stand up and start waving a flag that is radical, but you do need to be clear where you are and what you believe in and what you're going to do, and how you're going to do that. So it comes back to those things of purpose, mission, values. And those things are not, which allows you then to create narratives and allows you to then understand what those narratives are within your organization, so you can align everyone, and everyone can focus on what they're needing to do. They can understand how their job fits into the organization. We all kind of know how that ends, sort of equals employee engagement at the end. But a lot of people assume that purpose, mission, and values therefore needs to be either fluffy, or it needs to be liberal, or it needs to be it just needs to be defined.
Well,
And your purpose, mission, and values, your values could be, we all, oh, sorry, that's the postman. She always likes to bark at the postman.
yes, you have a world famous dog. We're beginning to
I
know
have
her
a
over the
world
course of the
famous
series.
dog. Absolutely. She can be the mascot. Your values can be really clear, and then it's about understanding what those values are, what that purpose is, and then do you sign up for that? So you could be really happy working for Amazon, going back in with a return to office 5 days a week. That could absolutely be your jam. That could be what you want to do. What they've done is they've been clear about who they are. They've not hidden it. They're not a wolf in sheep's clothing. They've gone, hello, we're here. This is what we do. This is how we work. If you want in, great. If you don't want in, great. We don't want you. And I think there's something around the clarity of, do you want to join that party or don't you want to join that party? And that's okay. Those organizations will find their people, they will find their tribe, and that's great. That could mean their tribe is not as diverse and will not have the diversity of thought that is required, that you could say is required in order to create a great organization. Because does that suddenly become difficult for working mothers? Does it become difficult for people who are in middle age, who have parents that they need to care for? What about people with childcare duties? What about all of that kind of good stuff? So you can argue all of that, but what people are doing is they're choosing, and they're saying, they've told me who they are, I choose that, thank you very much. I make my pact with them. And it's that contract of work, which is, I choose to give you my skills and you choose to give me money and hopefully interesting work. So I think it's about knowing your organizational values and doubling down on some of that stuff, so that you can actually create a narrative that is honest. And you're not trying to be something else. You're not saying, hello, we're Patagonia, but actually you're Amazon. That doesn't make sense. It's like, if you're Amazon and this is what you stand for, then tell us what you stand for and be honest about it. If you're Patagonia, be honest about it. And I think there's something around that, which is communication professionals can actually start looking at, okay, have we got, does all of that reflect what we're seeing and what we're feeling and how it feels to be here? Ask some of those questions, figure out what that looks like internally. How are your people feeling about that? And then start to recreate your narratives based on what you understand, because it's the places that are sort of saying, it's all about people. We think our people are the centre of our business. And then you're saying to the people, we're not listening to you. You've all got to come back into the office, even though none of you want to come back in. Then there's a disconnect. The say-do gap is too big, and everyone sort of goes, oh, break trust.
Well, there's obviously there are lots of levels of which all of this stuff is happening simultaneously. But the say-do gap is clearly the pivot point for all of the stuff that we're talking about, and it's really the without offending the vegans out there, it's the meat and potatoes of what we're going to need to be doing over at least the next 4 years. Is A, identifying what the say-do gaps are. B, being straight with our organizations about, this is a say-do gap. Do you want us to spend our time defending it, or do you want to have us help you close it? And then operating on the basis of what the whether we're talking to the stated values or the actual values.
It's 100% that. I think it's, there's, yes, we could get drawn into all kinds of, your original question was really well presented, but it was so complex and there's so much there. Or you can say, okay, what is it that we actually need to do within our organization? Where do we need our people to be? And a lot of this is about how you align your people in order to create the revenue, create the product, be productive, create the revenue, et cetera, in order to be able to do great work and to do great stuff, which actually brings in, you hit your quarterly targets. Isn't that fantastic? If there is a say-do gap, that's the easiest way of burning trust. If you burn trust, you're ultimately going to start burning things like reputation, because people are going to talk about you in the market. We've got Glassdoor, we've got lots of those sorts of things where people go out and say, actually, they say they're this, but they're not. They lied. And as soon as you've got something where there's a say-do gap and people feel that you've lied or you've not been honest with them or 100% truthful, because you don't have to be, you can twist the truth, but if it's felt like it's being spun or it's being twisted, what else are they twisting? What else are they lying about?
No,
What else are they
absolutely.
saying? So can we trust
Absolutely.
it when they talk about how they treat their people? Can we trust when they talk about how they treat their suppliers? How are they treating me as a customer? If they say, oh, it's all about our customers, and then you read that they've all got, Trustpilot one star, you gotta wonder. So people then move away from those brands. Well, there's your revenue, bye bye. There's your people, bye bye. It's everyone sort of starts to move away. If you own some of that stuff, some people actually will do it because they want to do that. Some people are that contrary. I was listening to radio phone-in sometimes. It was just on. I don't listen to a lot of them because sometimes they're not great for my mental health. But I was listening to this one, and somebody phoned in and said, and it was all hypothetical. It was, you're in Britain. Would you vote for Trump if you were living in America? I mean, what kind of a phone-in is that? And this guy said, yes, I would, because everyone's telling me I shouldn't, and therefore I'm a contrarian, and I'm going to do it because everyone's telling me I shouldn't. But there are people who do that. So
right, and there isn't time for us to relitigate the political dynamics of the U.S. election.
No.
There's a lot of that conversation
We're not
going
going to
on.
go there.
At the moment. But I think really what we're trying to do is prepare people for what we're anticipating in the after.
What can you practically do as a communicator if it's all feeling slightly overwhelming and there are all of those questions that are happening within your organization, and you think, oh, we should go out and have a town hall and allow everybody to say how they're feeling? That's group therapy. Like that is not necessarily something that corporate communications teams are ready and set up to do. I would advise, and I would strongly advise not doing that, unless you are in a position where you have all of the right people and all of the right skill sets in order to be able to help people with anything, an emotion, and not to put too fine a point on it, for some people, trauma that may come up. Don't do that unless you're ready for it. But this is about understanding how you can figure out what is your job as a corporate communicator. You are looking after the reputation of the organization. You are making sure that you minimize risk. You are aligning and focusing your employees. You are making sure that your customers understand what you stand for, what are you selling, how does that work, giving great employee customer experience. You're making sure that the employee experience aligns with the customer experience, all of that. So if that's what your job is, put some boundaries around that and say, this is where I focus. And start looking at, as we've just said, purpose, mission, values,
and there's
narratives.
tangible things, right? And there's tangible things that communication professionals can start doing today to get themselves and their organizations prepared for what's to come. I think the first step, I see about 5 different steps. The first step is getting on paper what your stated values are and how your employees, stakeholders, and managers see your actual values, so that you know what the magnitude of the gap is going into all this. Second of all, look at what your organization's stated and actual priorities are. My suspicion is that a lot of organizations' priorities are going to be survival until they figure out what the hell's happening. But there will be different flavors and different tactical elements of that. There will be a need to look at the organization's tone, particularly in certain geographies. Organizations that have emphasized certain themes which are now politically unpopular are going to need to look at, do they double down on these themes and hope to pick off those people who are dissatisfied with the trend, or if they align with those themes so as not to offend. And then the extent to which the compliance regime will change. So, for example, in the US, you're already seeing anti-trans legislation being proposed. To what extent are organizations going to resist or facilitate compliance with these issues? and the extent to which there's going to be divergence between what goes on in an organization in the US, what goes on in the Middle East, what goes on in China, and what goes on in Europe. So the extent to which you can start inventorying this stuff, that I think will put you in a position, A, to deal with it, but also to be able to present a case to
Yes.
leadership that you're the person to help deal with.
Yes.
Because you're the one who's given this stuff some thought.
It's exactly that, isn't it? It's about, I think there's some interesting stuff. So yesterday online, The Guardian made a huge announcement that it was leaving Twitter. Sorry, X. Lots of comments about it, and it was all over my social media. It popped up everywhere, literally everywhere. And I thought this is really interesting. Okay, let's see what else. On the same day, the Financial Times ran an article that said a lot of advertisers are now going back to X. So you've got companies that, and they're doing it because they want to curry favour. The Guardian is doing it for its reasons. Go read about them. I'm not gonna paraphrase them. They've written them quite beautifully. But on the same day, so you can see this divergence, which World Economic Forum was talking about, societal polarization, which we've seen. And if you actually look at that election, the election that you've just had, it's not sort of 90% Trump, 10% Kamala. It's kind of 51-47, which is very similar to Brexit in the UK, which was 48-52. It's not that everything is one or everything it's the other. It's actually that there's a demarcation down the middle, and you've got about half and about half.
Right, but 50-50 in a winner take all system.
Exactly.
Is 50-0.
Exactly. But that does mean that you've got people within organisations, you've got people within society who aren't all about that. So you do have your Guardian who said, we're out, we're off, we're going to do other stuff, we're going to other places. And we can do that because we have a really good subscriber model. I thought that was really interesting. So they're looking at what is our business model, how can we do that? The advertisers are looking at how can we make more money?
Well, but there's another side of this, which comes back to the regulatory picture. I mean, the U.S. currently, internet policy in the U.S. is based on something called net neutrality, which is that all internet traffic has to be treated by carriers, cable companies, satellite companies, what have you, as equal. You throw this legislation away, and X is going to be in, potentially, and this is a worst case scenario, but it's not unrealistic. X is in a position to become the WeChat of the US. The thumb could be placed on the scale to such an extent that the Musk ecosystem gets preferential or perhaps even near total access to the US internet customers, relative to the same way that WeChat does in China.
So take that one step further. Where do you see that going? Play that thought out.
I could see X becoming the social network, the online shopping network, the news network, the podcast access network, and all of the other channels that we rely on being either shunted or even outright banned, as the U.S. had been attempting to do with TikTok. Now Trump is talking about backing away from the TikTok ban, but the precedent's been set. Russia closed off access to LinkedIn for 3 years. What happens if the U.S. closes off access to LinkedIn for some spurious reason? I mean, we don't know what the resilience is going to be of the legal and regulatory system in the U.S. in the face of all of this, but clearly for communication professionals and news outlets, assuming that we're going to have the same access to free channels and distribution going forward, it's an assumption that's certainly worth looking at.
Or does it become the rise of VPN access?
If the extent to which VPN access is viable in that environment, but that completely comes into the realm of how internal communication looks at channels and looks at distribution. to what extent are we going to be able to rely on SaaS platforms for this stuff? To what extent are we going to be able, are we going to need to consider, the kind of the most defensive approach would be to have on-premise hosting of, an intranet or, employee communication portal type thing from a corporate perspective. From a community perspective, we might need to go back to kind of, freestanding chat groups and networks and,
So taking it
you
out of
know,
the cloud.
either taking out the cloud or moving on to less
Yeah.
sensitive clouds that are less likely to be messed with.
I mean, there's some interesting stuff there from just purely from an energy perspective, and where does the energy come from to power all of this stuff, and how does that work from an energy perspective? Which we've already seen with the rise of AI, and we've seen Google re-establishing nuclear plants and commissioning new nuclear plants because they realized that they needed so much energy capacity that they don't have, and that they are projecting into the future with the continuing development of AI and the speed and the pace at which that is developing. So there's some interesting stuff there, and I think it'd be really interesting. That's a conversation that I would love to hear at one of these future of work conferences, which are sponsored by all of the lovely platforms. It's like, what does that look like?
Well, maybe we need to get somebody onto the series who can talk intelligently about AI. So we may need to revisit our lineup a bit. We've roughly set our lineup for the next 8 episodes, but that's an important piece. The other issue is, of course, where does AI policy go? Does it go into a walled garden type paradigm, or is it something that exists behind firewalls, or what? There's the ability of people to pour in data and extract stuff that's been extracted from data. What the governance and what the policy around that's going to be, and it's anyone's guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's still very much all up for grabs, isn't it? And everyone's looking at the big tech companies kind of going, oh, help. But there's some interesting conversations. There's some interesting people to follow on LinkedIn. Ethan Mollick, who wrote Co-Intelligence, is someone that I follow a lot. And if you're looking in the communication community for somebody who's really up to speed on everything that's going on in AI, it's Frank Diaz for me, who really kind of gets it. He's exploring it. He's playing with it. He's playing with lots of different types of it. Every time he posts something, I'm like, oh, that's a new one I haven't heard of. Right, got to add that to the list to have a play with. And he's looking at it from lots of different sort of kind of sort of ways around it. But coming back to some of this stuff around, how do communication professionals navigate the next 2 years, 4 years, whatever that might look like? What other challenges do you see particularly that you want to raise and discuss?
Well, I think, obviously my focus has been how do we adapt to the next 6 months. But I think if we're looking at the next 2 years, for me, a lot of the issue is going to, particularly for people working in international or global organizations, the ability to manage divergence between standards between different geographies. And it's not a new issue. An organization with a strong DEI policy may have, some of these organizations are adapting this in their Middle East operations because the Middle East cultures are not compatible with, certain Western definitions of DEI. So I don't think that's a new trend.
No.
But it will be applied to new geographies. And how do organizations maintain, consistency in their values and principles when these divergences are becoming more and more?
It's that, isn't it? It's that these things already exist, but they exist in regions where there's that's what happens in that region, but it doesn't happen here. What happens when some of that stuff actually moves into the region where you assumed a certain level of stability, and you assumed a certain direction, you assumed a certain rules? What does that change? Well, if you are, as you say, a global organization, you're already doing something like that because of your Middle Eastern operation or your Asian operation or wherever it might be. what can you learn from there? And actually it's about, if you're global and you have people in all of those different areas, how can you flip it and learn and listen and understand? Which is why I said VPN access earlier, sort of slightly flippantly. But when I was in China and certain things were blocked, I was visiting and I was told, oh yeah, don't worry about it. And it was my Chinese colleagues who said, oh yeah, don't worry about it. Use this VPN, do that, do that. Now you can access everything that you need to. Because there are ways of adapting, there are ways of doing things. So I think it just means that stability, that what you considered to be simplicity is disappearing, and actually you just need to adapt and flex. And the one thing communication professionals are usually really flipping good at is adapting and flexing because the amount of stuff that we get where we've got a plan, we know that plan is usually about 80% right, but there's always a 20% flex. There's always 20% where we're trying to figure out, okay, that doesn't quite work, so we've got to amend, we've got to tweak, we've got to, all those lovely words. We're really good at that.
But it's the great Mike Tyson line: everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Correct.
And we're good at getting punched in the face because we get punched
Quite
in the face all the time.
Quite a lot. But it's that, I get knocked down, but I get up again. We do that as well. We tend to get up. So how are we? But it's not how are we doing that. It's understanding that is something that we're very good at. But for me, I think it's also something that is something that is also really hard and takes a lot of energy. So are we making sure that we are looking after ourselves and that we have our processes in place, that we have our ways of, we know how we do certain things, so that we're not just getting pulled left and right and we're getting asked to do, we need to kind of sort of ground ourselves so that we can actually be really helpful and really useful. As you said, do that thinking so that when people come to us and say, hey, this, and you say, we've been thinking about these things, what do you think? Where does this sit?
Well, the grounding piece that you mentioned is absolutely critical here, and it ties into a couple of other things that you mentioned, particularly around the Edelman Trust, the relative credibility of corporate leaders as spokespeople, particularly externally. Now, in a post-factual political environment, the issue of a corporate honesty, I use the singular term, a corporate honesty, becomes utterly critical from a communication perspective. The organization has to establish its version of the truth. Forget about the gap between its version of the truth and reality. There's the need to operate from a shared set of assumptions, a shared set of measures, a shared set of, a shared vocabulary, a shared understanding of where we sit in relationship to this stuff. And I see that as being something that communications people need to take the lead on. Because if you've got an environment where the underlying honesty isn't trusted, then how do people know that you haven't met your targets, or that you have met your targets, or that the rules are being complied with? There's got to be some underlying internal integrity so that the organization can function. It's something kind of like what I called the Pravda principle. Well, I wrote about it like 15 years ago. What was the role of Pravda in the as the newspaper of the Soviet Union? Pravda was meant the word truth in Russian. Did Pravda print the absolute objective truth? No, but it was the daily record of what the party line was. Their version of the truth. And you could read certain things into it, like, for example, when they talked about, we've had a bumper apple crop this year. This was a message: go buy apples because there are going to be a lot of them, and they're not going to be around for very long. There were a lot of coded messages baked into this that people could interpret. But we're it's not necessarily going to be possible to rely on external news to have a shared understanding of how do you operate in an environment like this. So this doesn't just make communication a nice to have. If you don't have a functioning set of concepts, realities and language, you're not going to be able to function as a business going.
I think it's that, isn't it? It's that shared language, shared understanding of what certain things mean. Because you can call something, you can use a certain word for something, and you can get 10 different definitions of that, but depending on who you talk to. I think Jenny Field did that, didn't she, recently with the word authentic, and this huge range of things that people were saying, well, this is what authentic means, because everyone kind of personalizes it and takes their own slant on it, and there's a different perspective. But actually, you've got to have that shared language, you've got to have that shared understanding. So if someone says, this was something I kind of really struggled with during COVID times. I think you and I had a conversation way back when, where suddenly everyone was like, it's hybrid. And I went, I don't know what that means. Because everybody had a version of what hybrid meant. It was 2 days in the office. It was 1 day in the office. It was 3 days in the office. It was, you can come in whenever you like. It was, oh my goodness, they can't all mean the same thing. But they all had the same word that everybody was using to define something that was completely different. And if you were I only want to be in the office 1 day a week person, but you were going into a hybrid of 3 days in the week, that you were going to get a rude awakening, and there was going to be a disconnect. And it's that disconnect that causes that kind of, that, not to put too fine a point on it, societal tear. It just kind of goes, ooh, it's like these little tiny little societal rips that suddenly sort of become bigger and bigger and bigger, because you think it's one thing and they think it's something else. You're both right. You just haven't had a conversation and agreed what it actually means. And it's about defining that, making sure that when
Shared definition,
making sure that when you use language, you are really clear about what exactly it is that means. So avoiding ambiguity, avoiding sort of these sort of shades of grey of, oh, well, we're going to dance around in some language over here that doesn't really say anything, but actually there's words on a page. That's not okay. Because that's where it gets really tricky for people to understand what anything means.
I can see organizations defaulting to that, to adapt to the changing demands of U.S. stakeholders without alienating their stakeholders elsewhere. But that's not necessarily going to create enough coherence for people to operate in on a day-to-day basis.
I almost wonder if there's going to be something like, we've had greenwashing. I'm wondering if there's going to be some sort of like Trump washing.
Well, I think we're going to look at Trump washing. I think we're going to look at truth washing. And we're going to look at, for lack of a better term, we're going to look at values washing.
I think it's really sad if we get to something like values washing. And I think it's really sad if people go out and say, it's all about our people, and then they do things that are not all about their people. I think that is really sort of pretty tragic. Interestingly, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier when we were having a quick chat, there was, so talking about those two definitions of Friedman, all about profit, business is sort of like, is, it's more, deliver value to customers, invest in employees, Patagonia being the poster child for that kind of thing. There was an article I saw this morning, and I haven't read the whole thing because it was only sort of a picture of the top of it in Fortune, and I don't have access. I don't have a subscription to Fortune. But the conversation was being raised by Emily Firth, and she was talking and asking Brian Chesky, so B&B CEO, has decided that and has made this comment, which is, I don't think I should be hired. When I hired smart people and I got out of the way and let them do stuff, it was a disaster. So I'm going to return to founder-led, and it's all about me, and I'm going to make all the decisions, and I'm just going to hire people who go away and execute them.
Well, there's clearly a cultural thread around this, and this is from an organizational communication perspective, this is probably the second biggest issue that we need to deal with, aside from the internal consistency between values, principles, and day-to-day operational facts, is our organizational leaders going to take the US election results as a license to lean into their authoritarian impulses? And are they going to take that lesson that this is what people want? Do people want to be told what to do, or do they want to be listened to? And certainly the data that we've been collecting inside organizations doesn't show a great deal of appetite for being on the receiving end of founder mode.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because during COVID, he was lauded as, his letter to employees when I think he was one of the first to lay off some employees during COVID, and the letter that was written, it was absolutely lauded in the communication communities that I was in as being the best practice, best example, best blah, blah, blah but best of the best of the best of what this type of communication was. And it was all about putting people first. It was all about, we're really sorry to see you go, we're going to make sure we look after you, we're going to try and introduce you to as many people as possible, we're going to give you almost like aftercare. It was the Airbnb aftercare of the people that it was letting go. And suddenly we flipped in less than 4 years to, yeah, I've had all these really smart people, and it could just be clickbait headline. I don't know, because I didn't read the whole article. So if anybody has read the article and can comment, please do, or can share a free access version, please do, because I'd love to read it. But the clickbait headline says that's completely flipped, and actually now I just want people who do as they're told. I don't want people, so it's taking agency away, it's taking the smart, great ideas, empowerment, all of those things that actually equal employee engagement. It's taking all of that away. And yet in an Edelman survey, I think that was done in 2023, apparently CEOs and CCOs were all talking about employee engagement being the most important thing that they were trying to, 61% of them said, yeah, it's all about employee engagement because we get that engagement leads to other great stuff. So it just, there's these real sort of, it's black or it's white. It's not, there's no kind of space in the middle.
Well, I mean, there's actually a ton of space in the middle looking at it from another perspective, which is that, there will be some leaders who go back into founder mode. There will be leaders who see this election as a license to indulge their own authoritarian impulses. But at the same time, the underlying physics of how organizations operate, and really the underlying physics around how electorates operate, has countervailing trends to it. The role of influencers, the role of advocates, whether it's podcast hosts or whether it's people in communities who are seen as avatars of either MAGA-ness or, liberal goodness or what have you. The extent to which influencers and individuals and organizations are trusted and credible and followable, particularly when there's more skepticism of the quality of news that's going into the system. Ignoring that ecosystem of voices and drivers of activity could be potentially catastrophic for organizations, particularly if the economy proves sufficiently resilient to deal with the political shocks. If the economy starts to collapse under the weight of this stuff, employees will hold on for dear life, and they will do what they're told to a certain extent. But, putting that cart before the horse might actually accelerate the process in a not too healthy direction.
I mean, just adding to what you just said there's some really interesting stuff, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier, doesn't it, right at the beginning, which is, if that is where Brian Chesky wants to be, and if that's what he's saying, then everybody now at Airbnb goes, okay, well now we know the lie of the land. So if we're happy with that, then great. Presumably from a communication perspective, that means they're reviewing all of their values, their mission, their statements, their narratives, sort of review that. Because if you were sort of to join or to work with Airbnb and think that they were, and take it back to that letter from early 2020, comparing it to where, to the article, I think it was from this morning on Fortune, that's two very different, it feels like two very different organizations, but it's the same organization. So it also has the, it's being on, again, it's back to that honesty. They've been honest. So if that's what he thinks, and if that's where it is, then there is a value in the honesty in that, because as a communications team, as a communications professional, you're not trying to hide black with white or white with black. You're not trying to hide something that is opposite with you've not got that discrepancy that you're fighting against. So there's a whole piece around that. I did have a second point, and it has now completely gone out of my head because I was explaining the first point. Never mind, it will come back to me.
Let me go back to what you said about Airbnb reviewing its messaging and narratives. I mean, Airbnb should be reviewing its messaging and narratives, but actually, there's a very simple narrative that's come out, which is my way or the highway is the narrative. And, the extent to which people will be able to completely pivot, the speed, forget about how people, feel about their long-term future in the organization. There's also going to be the pivot that's going to need to take place from, being a listening, deliberative organization to being a, an instinctively and potentially capriciously directive organization. And how you do that without blowing the place up in a matter of ways.
It's going to be an interesting one to observe, definitely.
But at the same time, though, and this is the other question that I have about where the U.S. is going. Is it going in a direction of trying to create an optimal business climate for for the big corporations that have been supportive of this political trend, or is it moving more towards maximizing political control without much regard for the economic consequences? Because that's going to be a big piece of it as well. Because I mean, if you're a corporation, even if you've got authoritarian impulses, you have employees and you have customers, and if you're not going to be delivering through those employees to those customers, you can't just assume that they're going to continue doing business with.
It's interesting, isn't it? I listened last night to When It Hits the Fan, which is a podcast on the BBC. And it's all about PR, corporate communication, and it's sort of, they take specific things that happen and they kind of look at it from a corporate comms lens, a PR lens. And it was really interesting. And what they were looking at was big corporations in America. And if you look at the numbers, so how much money did the corporations give to each campaign? And most of the big organizations gave money to both campaigns. They give on either side because they're hedging. They're going, we'll give you a load of money and we'll give you a load of money too in case you get in. And there were conversations around some of the organizations. They came up with two. They looked at Apple and they looked at Walmart. And of course, my spidey senses went up for Apple because obviously I was there for a long time. And one of the things that they said was, if you look at Apple gave, I can't remember how much, lots and lots of money to Kamala Harris, and it only gave something like $75,000, some really random number, but I think it was about 75k to Trump. So there was a real big discrepancy in the amounts of money. And actually, if you look at some of the others, Microsoft, Google, etc., they were all giving, it was all kind of sort of 50-50. The money was going between the two. And they were talking about, what does that mean for, obviously these numbers will be looked at. Obviously these numbers will be considered. What does that mean from a lobbyist perspective? And there's lobbyists and there's the whole arm of communication that I don't particularly know a huge amount about, but that they will be looking at those lobbyists, and lobbyists will be getting in there to try and figure out, okay, how do we make sure that we're getting what we need? How do we make sure that we're not hated? How do we make sure that the incoming government and sort of looks at us favorably? And how important this kind of thing is, particularly for companies like Apple, who make a lot of their hero products in China and not in the UK, the US. So where does tariffs sit with that? How does that work? And they compared it to what happened in 2016. Sorry, I'm making noise because I'm feeding my dog at the same time. Look, there is a dog treat. And they said this happened in 2016 and Apple were given special dispensation. So it's all sort of looking at if you've got these, Trump puts tariffs on things coming in from China or coming in from other places, who gets special dispensation, and are the lobbyists working for that? And so you've got this whole area of communication that is working to allow that stability for the communication area that I know more about which is internal corporate communication, to allow them the space to be able to do the stuff that we've been talking about. But I thought it was really fascinating. It was a really interesting slant on stuff that I hadn't particularly thought about before. And I know that you've kind of worked more in the political sort of realm. Where do you know, what's your reaction to those sorts of things?
Well, I think it ties back to what I was speculating around the US internet
Yeah.
ecosystem. That, given the current closeness between Musk and Trump, that the potential is there for favoritism towards the Musk ecosystem, potentially to the exclusion of all others, as there has been, for example, towards WeChat in China. And certainly the Apple ecosystem could be under intense pressure, in terms of A, being able to get access to it, and B, the extent to which its products are going to be viable economically going forward. Um, could I see Trump making an example out of Apple? Absolutely. The issue also is how unpopular is Trump willing to make himself early in his term by squeezing things that people take for granted.
And I think that was the piece with Walmart. Now I'm remembering the Walmart piece, which was actually, if you go to Walmart and you look at a lot of the stuff on the shelves, a lot of it comes from China. And how are people going to react if suddenly that stuff is 20%, 40%, 60% more expensive during a cost of living crisis?
Right, and I mean, whether Trump has any actual interest in addressing the cost of living crisis, even though he ran. That's also another question. And for that matter, geopolitically, whether Trump realizes that being friendly with China benefits the U.S. geopolitically, even if it doesn't necessarily suit his economic narrative. We don't know what that one's going to look like. And by the time this airs, there may be a lot more clarity.
I mean, but I was just going to say, bringing it back to kind of the communication professionals and how does that impact the work that we can do? Can you kind of bring those two things together?
Well, I think the key thing is that my advice to communication professionals is really to start asking good questions and being seen as the people who are asking good questions, the people who are raising these issues as strategic challenges facing the organization, people who get the risk implications of the various different positionings you can have. Whether you're doubling down on your values, whether you're adapting to the U.S. environment, whether you're going to diverge your standards between geographies, on sustainability or worker, employee relationships or what have you. A, B, to the extent possible, creating a glossary, creating proposing common definitions, so that there's a reliability to your communication, regardless of what your organizational truth is. Having consistency in the relationship with it is going to be also be critical. And also, the extent to which your organization is going to be soliciting employee opinion and responding to it. I think if you look at those things and be seen as getting ahead of the curve on them, you may be able to at least survive and perhaps even get, a level of permission and resourcing that's up to the task that's at hand here.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's about. I don't really have anything to add. I think you've said it all. I'm not going to add anything because you've said it. It's grounding yourself in that work, grounding yourself so that you can ask those really good questions, because otherwise, and this is where we kind of come back to that greenwashing idea, people coming in and saying we need to do this, and so everyone sort of runs after that, but actually nobody understands the implications of that. We've seen that happen with greenwash. We know that that's not the right thing to do. So how do you make sure that you are grounded, that you've done all of that good work, so you're clear what you can and can't do. You're clear what your employees think. You're clear where your customers stand. You're clear if there are, say, do gaps, that there are ways of being able to actually close them.
Right, and you're also aware of your exposure to, radical changes either in the political environment or in the tone of your leadership.
I mean, a lot of business continuity, I've run business, not run, but I've been part of business continuity planning before. A lot of it was around environmental disaster, or I think one was about possible terrorism and that kind of thing. But I know that there will have been organisations who have done BCP planning around political change, around those sorts of things, like what happens if suddenly the world as you know it shifts, and all of those things that you thought were your standards or your pillars are suddenly shaking or have gone away. What does that mean? What does that look like? And this is about somebody said to me the other day, I posted something on LinkedIn, and it was about effectively, it was about business continuity, but from a communication standpoint. And one comment came, and she went, "Oh, that we don't need to worry about this. This is business continuity." And I was like, "Yes, you do need to worry about this. Otherwise, as a communicator, a communications professional, you will be done too. You will be given stuff that may not be the right thing that you want. You will be given channels that may not be the right channels that will allow you to do the work that you need to do. So you do need to engage with that. You do need to roll up your sleeves and lean in to that." And it was really interesting. And it was only one person, but it was this sort of voice of, "Oh, someone else is doing that. I don't need to do that." And my reaction is always, lean in. Don't allow somebody else to just do it for you. Lean in.
No, I agree. We need
Lean
to be the
in.
people driving this.
Yes, lean in.
And even if there are other people who have this as their job, it's our job, because if we don't do this, then we're not going to be in a position to do anything more than distribute
Exactly.
Potentially inconsistent and destructive messages.
We become executors on somebody else's strategy that actually we probably don't agree with.
Well, and not only that, we end up facilitating the contradictions that we should be questioning. And I'm not saying communications people need to have the answers. Indeed, the less definitive we are about the answers, and the more expansive we are about the questions, I think that's what puts us in the best position. Because if we're the people who are being seen as looking at the stuff that people are taking, looking at the assumptions and kicking the tires on those, our chance at being relevant in this environment diminishes dramatically. If we are the people, if we are the people who are seen to be asking the good questions, our stock goes up. If we're the people who are, hitting the send button and cowering under our desks, then we become expendable. There's nothing stopping a CEO from just doing all employee emails and letting an organization sort everything else out. It's a stupid strategy, but there will be some that go in that direction. But to prevent your organization being that organization, you need to be the people asking the questions.
Yeah, I saw that strategy happen early in my career when I asked the question. I was asking questions about how we communicated to our employees about this. What are we saying? What's our narrative? How are we talking about this? What words are we using? And I was told to get back in my box because actually, as a CEO, he knew everything, and I didn't need me to ask any of those questions. And thank you very much, Janet. Go play elsewhere.
What happened to that organization?
Well, that CEO particularly. It was after a merger, and that CEO of the UK and Ireland was there for another year and then left. And then a new CEO came in, and he listened, and he was the one that gave me the job as to set up internal communications there. Because I asked the good questions.
Asking good questions. That's, I guess, the tenor of the times that we've got to deal with. I want to thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to navigating disruption forward with you, Janet. Thank you very much for listening, and we will be back with new episodes after the first of the year.
Thanks, Mike.